חברים, זה מושב המליאה האחרון, השעה 4:20, ואנחנו מתחילים את המושב האחרון של המליאה. אני חייבת להגיד שבכל השנים שאני מגיעה לכנס אין מצב שנשארים למושב ב-4:20 אחר הצהריים למעלה מ-120 אנשים, אז תודה לכם שהצטרפתם אלינו. המושב הזה בעצם, אני תכף אציג את הדוברת, מה שאני מזכירה לכם, ואתם בטח כבר מיומנים בזה, שאלות לדוברת ב-Q&A's, צ'אטים, אם אתם רוצים לנהל בצד, בשמחה. גם מי שרוצה לשאול בעברית, אני אתרגם את זה לאנגלית, אין בעיה. אומרים שטיימינג זה הכל בחיים, אז ממש ביום שישי האחרון הודיעה ועדת פרס הנובל, כי פרס נובל לשלום יוענק השנה לתוכנית המזון העולמי של האו"ם, ה-World Food Program. הפרס הזה ניתן בשל המאמצים של התוכנית הזאת להילחם ברעב ובחוסר הביטחון התזונתי בעולם, והפעילות של התוכנית הזאת כנגד הניסיון להשתמש ברעב ככלי בסכסוכים ובמלחמות. אז הטיימינג הזה זה בדיוק הנקודה I would like to welcome you all to our plenary session dealing with food justice, mainly food security and nutrition, and sustainable development goals in the era of the COVID-19. The UN Sustainable Development Goals seek to improve human lives, improve our environment, and foster prosperity. The presentation by Professor Janet Fleetwood will shed some light on some of the important issues we all need to deal with, especially these days when COVID-19 serves as an amazing example of the crisis that we're facing and the challenges of global food supply systems and really this pandemic tests our commitment to these principles adopted in the SDGs. Professor Janet Fleetwood is a faculty member at the Department of Community Health and Prevention in the Dornsife School of Public Health at the Drexel University in Philadelphia. Her work focuses on urban issues in public health, ethics, social justice, focusing on food insecurity, food safety, food waste. Her publications appear in leading scientific journals. Janet, I truly regret the fact that this conference is virtual, yet I'm sure that our viewers are keen to listen and absorb your presentation. So Janet, the floor is yours.
Hello. I'm Janet Fleetwood from Drexel University School of Public Health in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I'm pleased to be with you today. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint, and we will be talking about food justice and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm very pleased to have been invited to give this presentation at the Israel Society of Ecology and Environmental Sciences 48th Annual Conference. As you can see, the top photograph is Philadelphia, where I live and work, and the bottom photograph is beautiful Haifa. Frankly, I wish I were in Haifa. In any case, today we'll be talking about food justice and the SDGs from a framework of philosophy and public health. My background is in both of those. I have a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, California, and a master's in public health from the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University, where I now teach. We'll be considering the global pandemic of hunger wrought by COVID-19. We'll be examining the SDGs approach to sufficiency of the global food supply and environmental sustainability and food security. And then in my closing remarks, I'd like to consider, just as a model for discussion for the US and beyond, the newly proposed National Agenda for a Healthy, Equitable, and Sustainable U.S. Food System. It's notable that at the beginning of 2020, 135 million people faced acute food insecurity worldwide. This is a staggering number, but it is dwarfed by the new number. By the end of 2020, this number could increase to 265 million people suffering from acute food insecurity. Of course, the UN has a global humanitarian response plan for this, which includes looking at various steps to fight COVID-19 in the poorest countries, but really addressing those who are most vulnerable, especially those who are food insecure. With acute food insecurity expected to double before the end of 2020, it's a daunting task for the UN global humanitarian response. The FAO, or the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, has established 4 pillars of food security, which may be familiar to you. Of course, physical availability of food, economic and physical access to food at the international, national, and household level, food utilization, or the sufficient intake for good nutritional status for the individual, and of course, stability of these dimensions over time. Their definition of food security is a daunting one. The FAO says food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. It's a wonderful definition. It's an aspirational definition, but it's a definition that goes far beyond where we stand today. In the United States, we also talk about food security and food insecurity, and our Department of Agriculture has broken it down into 4 levels. High food security, no reported indication of access problems at all. That's where many Americans blissfully spend their lives. Marginal food security, 1 or 2 indications like anxiety over food sufficiency or shortage of food in the house, but no changes of diet or food intake based on that situation. Low food security, this is common to many Americans, reduced quality, variety, or desirability of diet, but little indication of reduced food intake. And finally, very low food security, multiple indications of disruptive eating patterns and reduced food intake. And this, unfortunately, is where we are and where we are headed to continue to be due to COVID-19. So what do we think about when we think about food justice? How do philosophy and public health work together to think about food justice, access, and sustainability? Well, food justice is both a concept and it's a movement as well, based on the belief that sufficient healthy food is a human right. It focuses on defining healthy food as food that's fresh, nutritious, affordable, and culturally appropriate, which is interesting, culturally appropriate, and grown locally with attention to the environment. So many of us have probably been in circumstances where we've seen food boxes, for example, donated to needy populations who look in the box and aren't quite sure what to do with the ingredients in the box. This has been a problem as recently as within the last 6 months here in Philadelphia, where food boxes were made for individuals in underserved areas, and they contain products, especially produce, that the recipients were unfamiliar with. So healthy food is not only fresh and appropriate as well. Ensuring living wage jobs for food systems workers. So food justice goes beyond just hunger. It goes as well to the workers in those systems from farm to fork, farmers, farm workers, processing plant workers, food service workers. And of course, many of you are familiar with the terrible COVID outbreaks among our meat processing plants in the United States and the many deaths that have resulted from that. Focusing on community control is the last element of food justice through cooperatives, faith-based initiatives, and community organizations. So when we think about food insecurity globally, what is it that we are thinking about as the upstream causes? Well, public health spends a lot of time thinking about and analyzing upstream causes. And for food insecurity globally, they are natural disasters, especially drought, which is exacerbated by climate change and global warming. And of course, drought has been a huge issue in the last few years. Population growth, poverty, of course, which is cyclical cyclical with poor nutrition. When you're poor, you don't eat well. When you don't eat well, you're more likely to become ill. When you're ill, you can't work. When you can't work, you don't have money to eat well. Terrible cycle of poverty and poor eating. Biofuel production, armed conflict and war, which can affect both crop yield as well as distribution of food and aid, and the inability to do so because of armed conflict. And finally, infectious disease, which in the past, people looked at HIV, AIDS, Ebola, and now we need to look at COVID-19. So what did we have for the 2019 Global Hunger Index? This is a map of what things used to look like. They've changed. But you can see where the extremely alarming in red, the alarming, serious, moderate, low, and of course insufficient data for North America here. This is what it looked like then, and you'll see shortly where we are now. To stop for a minute and look at our Sustainable Development Goals, we should look at what they are, what their goal was to do, and where we're going with them now that we're in the context of COVID-19. The UN set forth universal goals to enhance human lives, improve the planet, and foster prosperity. Those were our Sustainable Development Goals. They address poverty, inequality, climate change, health, environmental degradation, peace, justice, a host of important things. And it describes a vision that rests upon quality, sufficiency, and sustainability of the food supply. The food supply and food access is an essential part of these goals. Goal 2 in particular has set forth specific targets. By 2030, the target is to end hunger and ensure access by all people, in particular the poor and people in vulnerable situations, including infants, to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food all year round. Obviously, a very aspirational goal. There's more. By 2030, ending all forms of malnutrition, doubling the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, ensuring sustainable food production systems, and implementing resilient agricultural practices, maintaining the genetic diversity of seeds, and promoting access to and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. Increasing investment to enhance agricultural productive capacity in developing countries, correcting and preventing trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets, and ensuring the proper functioning of food commodity markets. These are wide-ranging and far-reaching goals, and today we're really just focusing on food insecurity and hunger, but you can see that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be tremendously affected by COVID-19. In fact, the FAO has a response to COVID-19, as you would expect, and is directly concerned about famine. To avoid famine and address the risks of the pandemic of hunger, the Food and Agriculture Organization urges countries to meet the immediate food needs of vulnerable populations, boost social protection programs, keep global food trade going, keep the domestic supply chain gears moving, and support smallholder farmers' abilities to increase food production. Again, admirable goals, but extremely difficult during times of COVID-19. Now, it's tempting to focus on distant, chronically food-deprived areas when we think about COVID-19, and we think about hunger, and we think about our history. Places like Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Northeast Nigeria, these are places that we think about when we think about food deprivation and hunger, widespread need. But in fact, times have changed. We need not look so far away to see the impact of COVID and food insecurity. And here you can see a woman in personal protective gear, completely covered, mask and so forth. And she's delivering a box from an organization called Leket, which is in Israel, and provides food boxes for people in need. And here you can see an elderly client. Food insecurity in Israel was a surprise to me. I have to say, I've been to Israel several times as a tourist, and was very surprised to learn that food insecurity is an issue there. As a tourist, I didn't see it. And it turns out there are many Israeli nonprofits that provide hot meals, gift cards for groceries, prepackaged food packages, and so on. And Leket is one of those organizations. You can see here, this is the mayor of Jerusalem handing out food, and women, of course, working, doing, processing food for donation. Leket Israel is a food rescue organization that I had the privilege to visit on my last trip to Israel. I had a wonderful tour of their warehouse and their offices, and had a really interesting series of meetings there. Leket collects leftover food from hotel buffets, corporate dining rooms, wedding, and other simchas. It provides food to 200 organizations that feed 175,000 needy Israelis on a weekly basis until COVID. Since COVID, the neediest, of course, have been hit the hardest, and Leket has distributed 60% more fruit and vegetables and 50% more hot meals than before COVID. In June 2020 alone, there was a 15% increase in demand for cooked meals and a 25% increase in demand for produce. Leket distributed 235,000 cooked meals in June. I'm not a part of Leket. I'm not paid by Leket to endorse them or even present them, but I wanted to present to you this important organization and give you an idea of how just one organization has had to respond to COVID-19 in just one country, just in Israel. This, of course, is going on around the world in places that can do so. But Leket is a wonderful example of an organization that has risen to meet the need as best they can. In the United States, food insecurity is a well-known problem. Even tourists to the United States see it. They see homeless people on the streets asking for food. They see people going through trash cans, even in tourist areas. It is also a hidden problem. We have families that look otherwise to be, quote, middle class, who have, in fact, food insecurity and get various sorts of support. It is not the same as starvation in areas with true famine. I would not say that hunger in economically developed countries like Israel and the US is anything like what we've seen in Yemen or the Democratic Republic of Congo. But you can see that hunger is hunger. And prior to COVID, there were more than 35 million people in the US, including more than 10 million children who were food insecure. In other words, they didn't know where or if their next meal was coming from. Now there are 54 million people, including 18 million children, who will experience food insecurity in 2020. The US has government-sponsored programs, like every country, I think. SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children Program, are both out there. They're government-sponsored, but they are woefully insufficient. There's not enough money, there's not enough funding, there are time limits and difficulties in applying. By no means do they respond to the full problem of hunger in America. So people rely on charities, including Feeding America, which is one of our big charities here, and local food banks and food pantries run by private organizations, and these are all often religiously based organizations. Our ubiquitous phrase in the US, if you many have seen it in other places as well, we're all in this together. And it's supposed to build a spirit of camaraderie, collaboration. But in fact, we are not. We are not all in this together. This is an example from the New York Times of a food line. This is not a parking lot. These are not parked cars. These are cars with human drivers in them, waiting for food handouts post-COVID. This was in San Antonio, Texas, in April. This, of course, it's Disneyland in beautiful Southern California, in Anaheim. And what looks like a pretty normal Southern California traffic jam is in fact a line for the Food Distribution Center, again in April 2020. So Disneyland, the happiest place on earth, and you see some of the Disney characters below, is in fact the same place where people have sat in their cars in food lines, waiting for handouts. This again, April 2020, this is the COVID-19 pandemic, which had reached Southern California by then. And by September, Anaheim had over 8,000 cases, about 2.4% of the population of COVID, with 240 COVID-19 deaths. That, in addition to the unemployment, the housing instability, and the rising food prices, have all contributed to hunger and problems with our idea of food justice and how people should be treated and what people actually have. So the impact of COVID-19 on food security in the United States has been pretty drastic. We have, as of September 2020, 6.6 million diagnosed cases, and we are fast approaching 200,000 deaths, and it's anticipated that we will surpass that. These are food lines in Los Angeles, where I actually grew up. And again, these are not parked cars. This is not a traffic jam. This is a line for food. Here's a line at the Philadelphia Food Bank. I now live in Philadelphia and have lived here some 30 years. But sadly, we have the same problems as every other city, sometimes worse. In many cases, our food security problem is much worse. And you can see here, this is a line for a food bank. Again, April 2020. What can I say about food justice? Well, it's not simply disparities, but it's class and race-based inequities. It's not just different. It's not just that I'm not experiencing what they're experiencing. It's that in the United States, food and hunger issues are concentrated in minority populations, in minority neighborhoods. So food justice and hunger are seen as issues for charity here, with limited support from government, as I mentioned. But low-income neighborhoods and communities of color in the US lack access. They lack access to small-scale farms, to fresh foods, as we've all heard the term food deserts. Many don't have farmers markets nearby, and they often have an abundance of unhealthy food options, known as food swamps. So plenty of fast food, not enough fruits, vegetables, dairy products, fresh fruits that need refrigeration and are not available, or are available at prices that are unaffordable to the population. So our response to the food crisis, to sustainability, needs to align issues of the environment with sustainable agriculture with issues of structural racism and socioeconomic, cultural, and racial barriers that exist in the US and presumably elsewhere as well. So as a point of contrast, what has been my experience with hunger and food insecurity and COVID-19? My experience and the experience of my colleagues and most of my friends has been pretty far removed from what you see with food lines. I and everyone else in my family are able to work remotely. My classes will be meeting remotely at Drexel. We are able to keep our same salaries because we're able to work from home. I have this lovely round holiday bread in the picture because my biggest aggravation today was when I put in a very large food order for the upcoming holiday with Whole Foods, which is a pretty high-end supermarket that delivers. When I put in my order for delivery and I got the order this morning, what was missing? The holiday bread, the round challah for Rosh Hashanah was missing from my order. And I was very aggravated and kind of annoyed until I realized that there are people who are unable to put bread on the table, not just who are lamenting the fact that they don't have the round holiday challah. And in fact, I'm baking one myself. It's rising while I speak. So it's not as though I didn't have the ingredients for the challah. I was just annoyed. It isn't here. So my experience is that no one that I know has or has had COVID. Everyone that I know is able to work from home, and we all have food to put on the table. But that's not to say that that's the usual or common, or that that's everybody's experience in the US today. It's not. So is there currently food justice based on the belief that healthy, sufficient food is a human right? Well, no, there's no right to food specified in the US. There are few government food programs, but they're insufficient. Food instead is provided by a patchwork of public and private entities in the form of credits or cards that can be used in supermarkets or actual food deliveries or food pantries. or places that actually serve prepared food. The second piece of that, farm workers. Farm workers in the US lack workers' compensation for injuries or illnesses. Health insurance, disability insurance in only a few states have protective legislation for farm workers. Many are paid below minimum wage, in fact, and can be fired without cause at will. Employment at will is a common thing in the United States. I know that's not the case in many other countries, but many states here are considered employment at will states, Pennsylvania being one of them, and you can be fired for, as they say, a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all. And that is certainly a concern for farm workers who are at the lower end of the pay scale, and many have questionable immigration status. And so they're very concerned about being fired and not being able to find another job. And finally, farmers have few protections in negotiating contracts with buyers. So small-scale farmers have a difficult time surviving when competing against large-scale agriculture. So how should we think about justice in a fair society? Well, I can give you a little crash course in social justice. It's going to be very short and by necessity, a really not sufficient summary of John Rawls' work. But I just will introduce a couple of the main concepts from a philosophical perspective and talk a little bit about food justice and how it fits. So how do we think about justice in general in a fair society? I'm a big fan of and often quote the work of John Rawls, who was an American political philosopher, very well known. In fact, he was an advisor to President Bill Clinton, and not in an official capacity, but came to the White House for dinner just to talk with President Clinton about his views many times. He established basic principles in an egalitarian economic system and set forth what he saw as a peaceful and tolerant system of foreign policy. He wrote his famous book, A Theory of Justice, which asks us to imagine a society that we would consider fair and just. He asks, what would that society look like? He considers how a free and rational and self-interested person would create rules for a just society. What would justice look like? So he embarks on a theoretical journey by creating a hypothetical situation, which he calls the original position, and then he tries to determine what principles rational, self-interested people would choose to assign rights and duties and determine how social benefits would be distributed. The principles, the so-called principles of justice, are chosen from behind a veil of ignorance, which assumes that no one knows their place in society, their wealth, their social status, or their natural abilities. So you wouldn't know if you were tall or short, strong or weak, whether you had a lot of education, not much education at all, and so on. And then people in that circumstance, behind the veil of ignorance, would devise certain principles for a just society. His book then provides a tool to critique our current social structure. He comes up with these two principles that he thinks people behind the veil of ignorance would come up with. The liberty principle, which is similar to Mill's principles, really based on John Stuart Mill's work, but it says that each person has an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. The second is the more important one for our purposes today, the difference principle. Social and economic inequalities are acceptable only when they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular for the least advantaged members of society. In other words, we're going to make sure that things are not terrible for the least advantaged members of society. Why? Well, among other reasons, because we might be that person. It assumes that broad liberties are valued by all. It assumes people would be risk averse. It focuses on improving the lot of the worse off. And it doesn't specify a particular social or political system, but it focuses on what justice requires of institutions, of society, and even to some extent of individuals. So he gives us a way to think about how society is structured, how it could be more just, and he emphasizes fairness and objectivity. And of course, that applies to exactly to food justice issues. So can the SDGs make progress given the dramatic negative impact of COVID-19? How will we ever use our social justice concepts, and the ideas from Rawls are good guidelines? How are we going to make things better for those that are the worst off, with food insecurity being such an issue now that we are under COVID-19 and all the problems that it entails? How much of the long-term food insecurity problem in the US is the direct result of longstanding social issues, including structural racism? That's a question for another time, another day, but certainly something to think about when we look at who has been most affected by COVID-19, both illness-wise, death-wise, and food insecurity-wise. And how much of the immediate food insecurity crisis in the US, and I'm just focusing on the US right now, but perhaps elsewhere too, is due to a fragmented and inconsistent approach to managing COVID-19, which resulted in widespread unemployment, dramatic food price increases, and intermittent shortages, and now coming housing instability. Well, two leading experts in the United States have proposed a new agenda called a National Agenda for a Healthy, Equitable, and Sustainable Food System. It was published just recently in the American Journal of Public Health by Nicholas Freudenberg and Marion Nessel, two experts in food and in food equity and justice. So they came up with a set of suggestions that I think are going to be useful for the US and for others as well, to serve as a model of what things we ought to look at when we think about food justice. So of course, number one, reduce hunger and food insecurity by increasing eligibility for our government programs, including for college students who in the US, many of whom suffer from hunger and food instability, and make breakfast and lunch universal and free in our schools. Dismantle systemic racism in our food system. That is a major problem in the US and perhaps elsewhere. Make healthy, affordable food available to all Americans. And here they're talking about federal and institutional food programs to expand access, to support farmers, and promote local economic development. They look at antitrust laws, they look at worker safety and compensation, and USDA subsidies. They reduce the burden of diet-related diseases by eliminating tax breaks for marketing of unhealthy food, which, as we know, is marketed preferentially toward less educated, lower income consumers and children. They support agricultural practices that reduce carbon emissions and other forms of pollution. They advocate restoring power and funding of our Environmental Protection Agency, our EPA, and that the US should rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. They advocate for protecting food workers, which I've talked about a bit before, revitalizing the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and what they call food democracy, promoting food democracy to allow state and local governments to approve food standards that are more stringent than federal rules. So some final thoughts. If we agree that an impartial yet self-interested rational person operating from behind a veil of ignorance, Rawls' term, would improve conditions for the worst off, then we need to address food insecurity. We are not, as Americans like to proclaim, all in this together. Rather, victims of hunger in the US, Israel, and elsewhere are suffering varying degrees of hunger and food insecurity, and in some cases, impending famine, under dramatically changed conditions that are not of their own making. The US has never been a leader among economically developing countries in ensuring food security or healthcare or several other important things. But perhaps the social changes brought on by COVID and by recent nationwide protests and the increasing focus on social justice broadly, including food justice, will foster deep conversations and propel forward the proposed national agenda for a healthy, equitable, and sustainable food system. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, very much. I have many questions from the audience. I'm not sure we'll be able to cover them all. I would like to start with the one sarcastic question is, how come people that don't have money to buy food have money to drive their car and stand with their car and the gasoline to wait for the food, to be supplied? So this is just a short answer.
First, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be giving this presentation. I was watching the questions coming up in the chat box, and I thought that one was especially amusing. All I can say is the cities that I showed those photos from, Anaheim, California, Philadelphia, are very much car cities. People are very reliant on cars for transportation. So the car is how they would get where they need to go. So that's one question. They're not necessarily walking or using public transportation. So many people do have cars. But the other thing is with COVID, the people giving the food didn't want to get too close to the people who needed the food. So they were asking people to please come in a car, remain in your car. We'll hand the box through the window or put it directly in your trunk, which is even better, so that there wasn't close contact between the individuals that needed food and the people giving the food away. So that was part of the reason that they came for food in cars. It was a social distancing measure. So you're right, they had to have gas, they had to have cars. Sometimes they came with neighbors or had friends drive them, but it was a way to keep from spreading COVID.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think was missing in the, it was six suggestions how to use it. I think they missed one very important one, is all the issue of community gardening. But because if your supply chain is getting nearer and you work in a community garden and you are in the open space and you're connected to, to the soil, that can improve your health and your food supply. So this is something that could be added. There is a question here about food waste. So yes. What's the, how can you reduce food waste in order to increase food security?
Yes, of course. The estimates are that about 1/3 of the food that we could be eating is wasted. So food waste is a huge problem in the US, but globally as well, and goes all the way from the growing process to what's wasted in the field, to what's wasted in manufacturing, to what's wasted by the consumer. So food waste is, of course, a huge problem. COVID has really exacerbated food waste everywhere, but certainly in the US, and I'll talk about the US initially. Milk, for example, 3.7 million gallons of milk had to be dumped after COVID because schools closed down, and the schools were the market for that milk. There were no kids in the schools to consume the milk. The transportation processes were disrupted, with trucking disrupted, and the milk, of course, is perishable and going sour. So they ended up dumping 3.7 million gallons of milk. So there's a pretty dramatic example of food waste. Similarly, we had an outbreak in the US of COVID in our meat processing plants. And the plants many of them were shut down for 2 weeks until President Trump demanded that they reopen. But anyway, they were shut down for 2 weeks. And during that time, 70,000 pigs were euthanized and not distributed as food. They were buried in landfills, basically, because there was no way to distribute them. The consumers weren't there to purchase them. Everything was just shut down. So food waste has been dramatically affected in a negative way by COVID.
And maybe the last question is if local governments fund the activities of the food banks, and if so, to what extent? And do they have any, hands-on figures about?
Yes. Health departments in the United States are very active with food security, hunger, and addressing food issues, as well as independent, small, charitable organizations. So our health departments are, of course, funded by our cities, and their state and federal funding for food as well. But the local health departments are the ones that keep the data about food insecurity and where it's most acute and how things should be serviced. But there isn't enough money coming from the government to solve the problem. So there are numerous small charities and small organizations that are privately funded that do get some support from the government, but are predominantly privately funded to try to address the food security issue. So it's a multifaceted approach, but some would say it's not a well-organized, cohesive approach that really solves the problem.
So we really need to keep on doing what we're doing and do it better.
Exactly.
So, Neta is pushing us to finish this session. Very interesting one. Thank you very much, Janet. This is an amazing figure that we have more than 160 people watching us right now. Very rare, because usually, in the afternoon, people here. So this is only the benefit, let's say, the benefit of this online conference and the ability to talk to you from Philadelphia and have you with us. Next year, it will be physical. So
I hope so.
Yeah, we all hope so. And good health to everyone and keep safe. And we have exactly 9 minutes to stretch ourselves because before we have the big Kahoot questionnaire. So thank you very much. You cannot hear the audience, but I will.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.